every source of power has its own limitation. Solar is not very efficient during the rainy season. Hydro is not very efficient during the dry season. Gas is not very efficient if it is tampered with or if you lose the pipeline or pressure drops. Coal also has environmental limitations and risks. So the best power is the one that gives you all of the options at the right time when they are prolific. So at this period of the year, most of our power should ideally come from gas, if we are not breaking the gas pipelines, and from solar, because we still have a lot of sun. And as we move into the dry season, into the rainy season, you might see less solar and more hydros and more coal, and then more gas kicking. And as you go out of the rainy season into more sunlight, more sunshine, more dry weather, the solar fires in again. That is how it will be by the time we finish what we are doing.
To still discuss electricity and its challenges is Mr. Wonodi, who is former CEO of Nigeria Bulk Electricity Trading Company and also founder and CEO of ZKJ Energy Partners Limited. You're welcome to Sunrise Daily.
Thank you very much.
Good to see you again, but it doesn't look like much has changed since you were last here. I think only recently you were also writing on how we found ourselves in this mess. Back page, one of the dailies. Just quickly, tell us what precisely, how did we find ourselves in this mess? Do you agree with Mr. Idika Kalu that it was because we did not look at the KPIs, the criteria that these companies who were interested in privatization were supposed to be meeting before they took over the assets?
Well, you know, there are two things. There is vetting before people get in and pick up the assets. And then, when they're in the assets, what do they do post-privatization? So, for instance, people could have presented technical partners at the time that the bid was done. And then we know in some certain circumstances, we've seen in some distribution companies where the technical partners left after the privatization. So, the issue might not be with the vetting, but it might be also with the monitoring of the performance post-privatization. And that seems like where we've had most of the problems with the privatization.
So you agree with him that the companies are due for a review?
Well, I think that to say that the companies are due for a review might be it might be too targeted. But let's say that the performance agreements, you have to look at it and see how the distribution companies or the generation companies or the investors are, how they are carrying on based on that performance agreement. So, yes, you want to look at the business again, and there's a need to.
So, for you, I mean, currently, from some of the challenges that you've seen in the sector, especially as it has to do with financing, what precisely would you say that government should be looking at?
Well, I think that government... there is the issue that everybody talks about, tariff, or where the tariff needs to be to reflect, especially for generation companies where they have to pay more for gas or the foreign exchange changes, right? We have to look at that. Then the other thing is that you have to look at the capital structure. So if you look at the businesses right now, what you find out is that most of the companies, especially the distribution companies, have a lot of debt in them. There's just bank loans, and the proportion of the investors' investment is much lower than it should be. So there is a need, when Dr. Kalu was talking about go to the banks and look for financing, I think that it's difficult at this point to begin to look at banks as source of financing. You have to look at equity, the owners of the business. So if the current owners are unable to raise money or put additional money in that, then they might have to look for other investors. And for government, I think that government should also do something about its own 40%. Not sell them, but maybe put some money on the table and then invite investors to match it. And if they're unable to match it, then there have to be a push to get people.
How big a challenge is finance as we speak?
It is a big challenge. It is a big challenge. The whole idea of privatization is so that government stops funding it and then you get funding from the private sector. So if that is not happening, then the privatization is facing a point where it's going to fail.
You say it's a big challenge. Is it the biggest challenge?
It is. In my mind, you know, we talk about liquidity issue. That is financing. It is the biggest challenge for the industry. It affects metering. It affects expansion of the network. It affects transmission. It affects borrowing by the generation companies to make additional investment. So financing is at the core of it. But what else can you do? You can do regulation and policies to help solve it. So you have to be looking at what type of regulations do we have, what type of policies, and how is the government monitoring the performance of these investors.
Well, for the everyday man out there, I mean, they're not very interested in the technicalities of this all. What they want is electricity.
Right.
You know, what would you be, I mean, if you were to break down certain things to them, what would you be telling them is currently preventing them from getting electricity despite all of the efforts government seems to have put in, you know, and they keep saying that this, at the end of the day, is going to lead to getting more electricity?
Well, you know, you have to, when you apportion or when you look at the value chain, the consumer, the generation company, distribution companies, you want to be sure that each person who is expecting a positive outcome has done his bit, right? So I listened to the clip that the minister put out there about whistleblowing policy. You know, I think it's a frustration that you find out that there are quite a number of people who can justify and say, well, I'm not even being given power enough, therefore, I'm going to bypass my meter, right? So people have justifications. So the first thing is that people need to pay their bills, right? That is one. And if you see people who are not paying, you have to actually do something, because at the end of the day, people pay that. But the other part is that I think that there is a serious need to look at how the amount of debt in the system and whether the folks in there have enough capacity to fund the industry. Can they continue, or must they go out and look for other people to get into this business and help them? And I think that Dr. Kalu also mentioned that it doesn't have to be a punitive